Thanks, Tim. Is this a good place for me to stand? Microphone-wise? Okay. Yeah, thanks for coming. It is awfully cold here. I'm used to cold in Boston, but wasn't expecting it here. So I wanted to talk about a problem that concerns what somebody can learn from their perception when their perception is influenced by what they fear, or what they want, or other expectations they have. Now, there's a lot of evidence from psychology that perception can be influenced by your prior expectations. So for example, in color perception, like a gray banana in a picture will look more yellow than some gray non-bananas. And in social perception, if you show people a series of faces that change very gradually from being pleased to being angry, so you have maybe 20 faces, and at one extreme the person's just visibly pleased, and the other extreme they're visibly angry, but in between there's just very, very small differences. And gradually it's called facial morphing. It gradually morphs from expressing one thing to express another. You can ask people to, tell me where in the series the change happens from pleased to angry. And children who have been physically abused will locate this threshold of turning to anger much closer to the pleased end of the spectrum. So they'll say kind of sooner that the face expresses anger than children who haven't been abused. So it's another example. In recent years, there's also been a growing set of experiments on how racial attitudes impact perception. So some examples here, a mild human collision where one person pushes another is seen, the same collision. It can be seen as either aggressive or playful depending on the perceived race of the pusher. Or a face in a picture is matched for coloring to either a darker or a lighter patch, depending only on the racial label written underneath the picture. You say this person is black, it's matched one way. If this person's white, it's matched another way. But it's the same picture. All you vary in the different conditions is the words, the label you put underneath it. Or a boy in a photograph is who's said to be accused of a felony is estimated to be older when the child is black than when the child is Latino. So these are very interesting experiments. There's a number of questions about how they should be interpreted. Of course, there's the big question, what do they mean about the society of the people from which the participants in the experiment are drawn. But even just at a more basic level, what exactly is the result of these experiments? How should we interpret them? And here, an important distinction is a distinction between visual appearances, which are a kind of perceptual experience, and then beliefs or judgments that you form in response to them. So for example, when you see some straight stick that's in water, and all of a sudden, I show you this pencil, and then I put it in a glass of water, and all of a sudden it looks bent to you, you don't believe that it's bent, because you know that the pencil can't change its shape just from my putting it in water, but that doesn't stop it from looking bent to you. So that's a case where you don't believe your eyes. You experience one thing, but you believe another thing. And that seems to show that we can distinguish between your visual experience, how things look to you, and what you believe in response or in reaction to your experience. You can also maybe appreciate that same difference between experience on the one hand and judgment by considering cases where what you judge in response to perception goes very far beyond what you see. So like you're looking for your brother in the kitchen and you see the kitchen's empty. Your experience tells you about what's in the kitchen, but what you infer on the basis of the experience is that your brother's not there. So here you do believe your eyes, but in addition you form other beliefs that go beyond what you experience. So these are some ways in which we distinguish between perceptual experience on the one hand and belief or judgment on the other hand. And when you think about that distinction in connection with these experiments, you can ask whether the expectations involved in these experiments are affecting the perceptual experiences, or are they only affecting how people are responding to those experiences at the level of belief? So for example, is it that gray banana I mentioned, does the gray banana really look yellow, or is it just that you are believing that it's yellow? So is the expectation affecting like the color that this gray banana looks to you to have, or is it just affecting the color that you believe it to have? Or in the case of the collision, is it that like the pusher actually looks more aggressive, looks to be pushing aggressively, or is it that you just believe on the basis of what you see that that's how he is, aggressive? So, okay, that's a question about how to interpret the experiments. I'm not going to, purport to settle how we should interpret any of those particular experiments, except perhaps to say that in the case of the banana and other phenomena like that, it's not just bananas. It's lots of different things, not specific to bananas. It's mainly taken by vision science to be a result about the actual experiences, not just judgments. But I'm not going to explore whether that's the right interpretation for all of them. What I want to talk about is a certain problem, a philosophical problem that arises in cases, be they hypothetical or actual, in which the impact of expectation reaches all the way to the level of perceptual experience. Because when that happens, we have several philosophical problems. And about 10 years or so ago, I became especially gripped by one of those problems. So here's an example of the problem that I became very gripped by. It starts with Jack and Jill. So Jack and Jill, you didn't know this, but they actually have a complicated relationship. So one day, Jill's very worried that Jack is angry with her, and she's anxious to see him to figure out where do things stand exactly. But when she sees him, her fearful suspicion that he's angry, it affects the way he looks to her. So in reality, his expression is neutral. If you saw Jack, just be like, his face would look neutral to you. But when Jill sees him, by this hypothetical case, when she sees him, she's in one of these cases where her antecedent suspicion that he's angry, accompanied by fear that he's angry, is actually impacting her actual visual experience, like how he looks to her, not just what she believes about him in response to what he looks. How he looks. So the question that gives us the problem that gripped me so much is, the question is, does Jill's visual experience give her reason to believe that Jack is angry? Okay, so does her visual experience give her reason to believe that he's angry? So that's a yes or no question. And on the one hand, you might think the answer is yes, because if that's how he looks to her, he really looks angry to her, and she doesn't have any indication that her experience is being affected by fear, say, then what else could she reasonably believe? She's just in this kind of utterly ordinary circumstance in which she looks a certain way, and has no reason to think otherwise, so she should just believe her eyes. That's just how he looks. So that's yes. But then on the other hand, if you think about it some more, it looks like what's happening here is that her fear is leading her to a belief just going via a perceptual experience. And you might think, look, if it was wrong to base a belief on an unfounded fear, then why should it suddenly be right to base the belief on the fear when the experience is intervening? Why, just because you put an experience in the middle of this path from the fearful suspicion to the belief, why does that somehow make it better? So the problem, as I saw it, is that this kind of simple yes-no question, it doesn't have a simple question, but it's not a simple answer. And so I call this problem the problem of hijacked experiences, to capture the idea that in these cases, perceptual experience is hijacked by fear and being overly influenced by it. So it's being overly influenced by a factor that in some intuitive sense shouldn't be steering it. So hijacking is like steering gone wrong, And this phenomenon of perceptual experience being influenced by antecedent expectations, it goes by various different names. Some people call it, as Tim mentioned in his introduction, some people call it cognitive penetration, and that term's been used both in vision science and philosophy to denote a whole range of different phenomena, a whole family of phenomena that they're not all the same thing. And hijacked perception, as I'm talking about it, is at best like a subclass of one kind of cognitive penetration. Because if you think about some cases where expectations influence how things look to you, your experience, they seem actually totally fine. Like, for example, a radiologist or a doctor or something looking at x-rays, mammograms, or, medical imagery. I don't know if you've ever seen these things, and I hope if you have, it hasn't been because you're sick, but I've had the chance, maybe through vision science, to look at many of these pieces of information, the sort that radiologists look at, and it's not just that, as I kind of naively thought at first it would be, that you see some image of some, innards of some body part, and then there's this, big black dot or something, and they say, oh, see right there, there's your problem. It's actually not like that at all. It's, just gray and undifferentiated things that to my unexpert eye look like, all kind of uniformly complex. But then the radiologist says, oh, you see, they point out, here's this thing. It's not that we're both seeing the black dot, but he or she knows that it's a tumor and I don't know that that's what it is. It's that they actually are parsing the whole image, differently than I am due to their expertise. So that's good. We're glad that society has people who have that kind of perception. It's very useful. So and that's for sure a case in which some antecedent expectations, indeed expertise, is influencing perceptual experience. So that should be fine. And if that's cognitive penetration, then nothing. There's no philosophical, well, maybe there are other philosophical problems or issues, but not the one I'm talking about. The one I'm talking about when I talk about the problem of hijacked experience is a problem, are cases in which your experience is influenced by these antecedent expectations, but in a way that in some sense gives those too much weight. It gives too much weight to your prior outlook on things and not enough weight on the properly perceptual inputs. So those are the cases that raise the problem of, does Jill's visual experience give a reason to believe that Jack is angry? So the problem, as I said, takes the form of this yes-no question. And so one form its solution could take would be to argue that one of those answers is correct. And this form of a problem is very common in philosophy, to have a problem that takes the form of a question where you don't know the answer. And one big difference, actually, between, I think, the humanities and the sciences, as I think of it, is that if you have a yes-no question in the sciences, oftentimes what you want is to just answer the question. And progress consists of settling on an answer and finding evidence supporting one over the other for the sake of settling on one. Whereas in this case, and in philosophy generally, I think that's not really what progress consists in, as I see it. So it's rather that one way you can understand a problem, one way you can make progress with a problem, is to understand a range of different possible answers or solutions to it. And to do that, you work through the kind of pros and cons, advantages and drawbacks of the various different possible answers. So, one does, and I do, argue for one answer over another one, but it's not that the sort of outcome that anyone aims at is to convince everybody else that this answer is right and just leave it at that. So I think that's a pretty big difference between the sciences and the humanities. I mention this because I think we're potentially an interdisciplinary group today. And similarly in literature, many times novels or other cultural productions, they are very attuned to ambiguities of a situation, complexity of a situation that they want to make clear a problem. It's not that they're telling you how to solve the problem, but they're just showing you what would happen if you responded to it this way or that way. Okay, so in this case, we have a problem that's the yes-no question, and one form of its solution is to argue that one of those answers is correct. And my solution is that the correct answer to this question is no. It's not reasonable for Jill to believe her eyes. And okay, it's one thing to say the answer is no, but why is the answer no? What makes it not reasonable for her to believe her eyes? Well, my view is that the answer can be no because of the way the perceptual experience was formed, in particular in the way that they can be formed rationally or irrationally in response to your expectations, even if you have no idea how your perceptions came about, and even if you're not aware, as Jill isn't aware, of the fact that you have in effect reasoned your way from your experience to your expectations. So believing that somebody's happy just because you want them to be happy, that's called wishful thinking. Okay, believing that someone's angry or dangerous just because you fear that that's called fearful thinking. And my solution says that Jill's situation is just like fearful thinking, except it's fearful seeing. And just as fearful thinking, wishful thinking, it redounds badly on someone as a rational agent. I mean, I'm not saying it's the worst thing anybody's ever done, but you're less rational than you will be if you didn't do that, or you could be if you didn't do that. And my view is that that's the same thing can be true in terms of redounding badly on somebody if they reason their way to a perceptual experience. Okay, so that's where I ended up after being gripped by this problem and thinking about it for a long time. And boy, did I feel I had a lot of explaining to do in landing there. So of course, this is not the only possible answer to the question, so it's not the only solution to the problem. you can say no, but you can give some different backstory about why no is the right answer. You can say yes and say, look, what else is she supposed to believe, and just leave it at that. Or you can be very, very sophisticated. You can say both, yes and no, yes in some way, and no in some other ways. So I aim to do really two things on two different levels when I was thinking about this, and I want to give you a feel for both of them. I wanted to understand the problem in the way I was describing before, where you understand a problem by understanding its potential solutions and their pitfalls and consequences and so on. But I also wanted to, make the best possible case for one particular answer, one particular version of no, the one I just outlined. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about why I don't like the answer yes, so why, at least that takes us to the no part, and then there's a lot more to think through as to which no is the right one. So say a little bit about yes and a little bit about both, and then a little bit more about my no, and my stuff. Okay, so why shouldn't you say yes? Why shouldn't you say yes, you should just believe her eyes, despite the fact that her fearful suspicion has given rise to her experience in this way? Well, the reason I think you shouldn't say yes, or what I landed on anyway, was if you're thinking about some consequences of saying yes in analogous situations, it seemed to have very strange consequences and very bad consequences. So here's another type of example. Before people really knew the true theory of mammalian reproduction, they didn't quite know yet how it worked, there are all kinds of theories about how it happened. And one of those theories, which you may have heard of, was called preformationism. There were different versions of preformationism, but one version said that sperm cells actually already contain an embryo in them. And all you have to do is, just like in gardening, you put a seed in a hospitable environment and then it grows. I'm doing this right now with an avocado seed, which I'm happy to report is actually working. Okay, but similarly, according to the preformationists, what you have to do is you have to put the sperm cell in the right place, and then this embryo will grow. But the embryo is already in the sperm cell before the sperm cell gets to where it ultimately needs to be. Okay, so that's a view that people had, and people argued whether it was true or not. And when microscopes were first invented, we didn't yet still know the true theory that we didn't know about fertilization. And so people looked, it was incredibly exciting to have microscopes, because you could look at all sorts of things under the microscopes. And it was like you were seeing into the structure of reality. It's very exciting. So some people looked at sperm cells under the microscope, and guess what they claim to see? The preformationists are like, oh, I can see it! I can see a little embryo curled up, just like I thought. And okay, there's a story. It's probably apocryphal, but it's actually, if you read embryology textbooks, there's often a kind of paragraph in the tiny history section before you get down to real business of proper embryology that will tell you the story is probably not true. But it's an interesting story, and for our purposes, it doesn't really matter whether it's true, because we still ask. Jack and Jill, that's not true either. I just made up these people, right? So hypothetical cases are fine if for this philosophical purpose of asking, suppose you were in that situation where, because you favored preformationism when you didn't yet have, all the evidence, you didn't yet know the true theory, but because you favored preformationism, you saw, that is, had a visual experience presenting this embryo curl up in a sperm cell, would it be reasonable for you to believe preformationism? Well, we can break that down a little bit. Would it, first of all, be reasonable for you to believe that there really is an embryo curled up in the sperm cell? Because now my thought was that, well, if the answer is yes, which is the analogous answer to saying yes about Jill, if the answer is yes, then, how to get there? The best explanation for why there's this embryo curled up in the sperm cell is preformationism. So it looks like if you say yes in the preformationism case, then you get to the situation in which you could actually count as at least incrementally confirming the theory of preformationism just via this experience. And that seems to me a very strange result. It seems to make the bar for confirming this theory, sort of low. Okay, so that was one case that made me feel very averse to yes. Here's another sort of case I'll put on the table in case, see how it strikes you. I was thinking about this guy, this is another person I made up, named Vivek. And Vivek, he's sort of vain, but he's a performer. And, he thinks that people like him. He's sure that people really like him, and it's not a bad way to go around the world. But actually, when he performs, there's all kinds of ranges of expressions on people's faces. Some people are asleep, some people are bored, some people are maybe disapproving, maybe some people are happy. But for Vivek, they all look really happy. So he's like, people really like me. You know what I mean? So Vivek is this vain performer who, whose experience is influenced by his vanity. Okay, and now you can just guess what I'm going to ask, the same kind of question that poses the same sort of problem. Is it reasonable for Vivek to believe, on the basis of his experiences that are influenced in the way I described by his vanity, that like these people, these specific people are like approving of him or something like that? And then, if you say, yeah, it's reasonable for him to believe that, think, well, Vivek, he's just, he's sort of in his own head a little bit, you know what I mean? He's like, starts off with this outlook and this expectation, and lo and behold, gets some confirmation of it. It looks like confirmation bias that's working through perceptual experience. And in other contexts, when we have confirmation bias, it's paradigm case of an epistemically bad thing. Meaning it's not a good way to get more knowledge or more understanding of the world. But then when we have it in perception, you can think, oh, why is it suddenly okay in perception? If it's not okay in these other contexts. So that was another kind of case in which something kind of fishy, circular about this that bothered me. So those were some considerations that pushed me off of the yes strand onto the no strand. Okay, let me say one thing about the both strand, both yes and no. So that's very sophisticated. Philosophers have all kinds of sophisticated things they can say, but I mainly care about answering no. So if somebody wanted to say, well, okay, in one sense it's rational, in the other sense it's not rational, that's fine. I'm much more interested in just the no part. If you say both, then you still have no, and that was what mattered to me. So I didn't wring my hands too much about both. What I really did wring my hands about, and I say did in the past because sometimes when things really are eating at you, really the only thing you can do is write them down, and then you can have other things eat at you instead. So that's what I did. So that's what the book that Tim mentioned, which is here. Okay, but why? Why no? I mean, what is underneath this no answer? And it was like somehow the power of Jill's perceptual experience to provide reason for her belief was lessened. I called it downgraded. But why was it downgraded? What about the relationship between her suspicion and her experience was having this effect of lessening the power of her experience? That was what I asked myself. And eventually the answer that I came to is that what was happening was a kind of inference, a kind of bad inference. I'll tell you what I mean. So I talked myself into the idea that you could actually infer from expectations or suspicions to experience, so that the conclusions of inference weren't limited to just beliefs or, but they could include perceptual experiences. That was what I talked myself into. Now, okay, I told you I felt that had a lot of explaining to do, so now has even more, now that I've mentioned inference, really an awful lot of explaining to do. Maybe more than you might think, because in the case of, even in medieval times, we had the idea that perception is the result of unconscious inference. Helmholtz, a 19th century psychologist, he certainly thought of perception as unconscious inference. So the term inference has been around for a long time as a name for one type of process that leads to perception, but here's the thing. The word inference has a lot of polysemy. It has many different meanings to the same word, attached to the same word. And the kind of inference I'm talking about is the kind that redounds on your rational status, like the kind that can make you rational or more or less rational. So just to get a feel for the contrast between that sort of inference and the kind, say, that Helmholtz was talking about. Helmholtz is credited with discovering the idea that the visual system operates with the assumption that light comes from above. And that assumption influences how the visual system interprets very low-level information about luminance and edges. In particular, it can make you see something as convex rather than concave because it's interpreting the luminance information, which doesn't yet say is it convex or concave. It's interpreting that luminance information in light of this assumption. So there's a famous illusion, which I didn't set up to show you, but there's a famous illusion that maybe some of you have seen called the mask illusion, where this mask rotates, and you start off seeing it as it really is, which is convex. But it's one of those masks that, it's just, when you look at it from the other side, it's concave. But then it rotates. There's a moment at which, when it just comes into, facing you, all of a sudden it pops out as like convex, even though it actually is concave. So that's an example. It's supposed to be the assumption that light comes from above. You can see it in action. You can see it as interpreting this thing as convex. Okay, Now, if you took two people who had the same mental states with the same epistemic status, like they're equally reasonable in all their mental states, and you just varied only whether they drew on the information that light comes from above to see the mask as convex, it's not like one of them would be more rational than the other, in whichever direction. So that's supposed to show how the notion of inference that Helmholtz is working with, which is quite common in vision science, not at all obviously the same notion. In fact, often it isn't the same notion as the notion I'm talking about. The notion I'm talking about, some people think, doesn't make any sense to apply to processes that land you in visual experiences. Okay. So when I talk about inferring to a perceptual experience, I'm talking about a different kind of inference. So that's one thing that needs explaining is, first of all, what is this notion of inference? And second of all, how could it apply to perceptual experiences? There's another type of thing that has to be explained, which is that we're used to thinking of perceptual experiences as things that you don't really, maybe things that you can respond to rationally or irrationally, like you shouldn't jump to conclusions from what you see. Or Sherlock, Sherlock sees what Watson sees, but Sherlock's like, aha, your wife doesn't like you, and you smoke these kinds of cigars, and you're not as rich as you used to be because you haven't sewn up your hat, so on. Whereas, Watson has much more impoverished, theory of the people they're just meeting. So these are, Sherlock's very smart, Watson's pretty smart, but, Sherlock is really milking his perception for all it's worth, but this is all a matter of how they're responding to what they see. That's reasoning, or deduction, as he calls it, somewhat inaccurately. Okay, so we're used to thinking of perceptual experiences as being the things to which you respond, things you respond to, not as things that are themselves manifestations of reasoning or rationality at all. So why? Because you reason from information you already have, whereas perception, it's thought in the traditional way of thinking about these things, perception is like a way of just taking in new information. Okay, like our paradigm of reasoning is things like assessing, like is it better to leave today or tomorrow, or like 7 o'clock or 7:30. Okay. And when you reach a conclusion from those sorts of reasoning, from our paradigm cases, the conclusion's never an experience. The conclusion is like a decision or maybe a belief. So how could experiences be results of reasoning? So these are all kind of things that I think anybody should say if I just kind of tell you out of the blue, like, oh, guess what? Perceptual experience could be the result of inference and reasoning, and then I tell you, as I just did, like what kind of inference I'm really talking about. I think it'd be certainly reasonable to scratch your head and wonder if that could really be right. So I feel the force of the head scratching and the wondering. And I'm not going to tell you my entire route to how I landed there, but I just want to highlight one of the consequences of thinking about it this way for an entirely different context, which is applying reasonable person standards in the law. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Okay. Work up to that gradually a little bit. Okay, so the way I can, if I want to make sure that I'm giving you a feel for, I want to make sure I'm giving you a feel for exactly what the main thesis, which I call the rationality of perception thesis, what that thesis is even saying. And it starts with the observation that philosophers in the tradition that I am in, which is the analytic tradition, they talk a lot about perceiving objects, books, tomatoes. Philosophers love tomatoes. Once in a while there's a banana. They're really branching out. But perception also has a social dimension, and I think it's important to think about the social dimensions of perception too, which isn't really all that different from tomatoes and bananas. It's just that what you're perceiving is different, and then the consequences of it can be different. So, for example, I was in Mexico a few days ago, and I was with my friend, and we were buying carrot juice, standing on the street, fruit juice, and the guy says to us, she's 20 years younger than me, so I'm 47, she's 27, and we're good friends. So he's pouring our juice, and in Mexico, people are very forward. It's very nice. They're very forward. They're like, eres su mamá? Like, are you her mom? And it was funny. It's just, I was a graduate student in philosophy, and, we're at the conference, are you her mom? And I'm like, number one, it's like, none of your business, but number two, it's like, oh, yeah, that's my mom. Anyway, he just thought, so anyway, he quickly sensed he had to parse the situation. You often do want to know, like, who are you interacting with and so on. That's completely natural. It's just a question of how much do you say out loud, and I didn't mind. I'm like, no, yo soy mamá, pero no de ella. Because I'm somebody's mama, but not hers. Okay, so, and you can, but one does, we do, like whether you say it or not, you very quickly sense or anyway, form hypotheses about social relationships between people. So another example also from Mexico. Mexico's a good place to give these examples, to draw these examples from, precisely because people are always saying exactly what they think. So another friend of mine was walking with her professor, who was a man, and who was from the United States. So they're walking down, this place, and then, someone comes toward them, an utter stranger, and he says to the man, assuming he speaks Spanish, he says, tu novia tan bonita, like your girlfriend's so beautiful, and it's just incredibly embarrassing, because it's a professor, it's like that was not at all their relationship. Luckily, he didn't speak Spanish, so it was good. So like it all worked out okay. So she was sort of conditionally embarrassed, but not in the didn't have terrible consequences in the moment. But if you think about like who should you ask for directions, like you've got to ask directions for somebody, and there's all these options. Who do you ask? It's like, well, someone who you might think someone who looks trustworthy or who's not good, looks relaxed, kind of approachable and knowledgeable. Maybe if they're lost, if they look like they don't know where they're going, then probably not going to help you. So there's this notion I like, the notion of social affordances. So affordances are kind of suggestions about what kind of interactions are possible in the situation or likely in the situation. So when you kind of size up someone as like, this is the person I want to ask for directions, what's happening is that you're kind of, something about the situation seems to foreground some possibilities of interaction, like this person's going to give me some information that I can use, and then backgrounding other possibilities of interaction, like they're going to get mad at me, or they're going to be rude or unhelpful. And then there are other possibilities just totally off the radar, like, it just doesn't occur to me that if I ask this person for directions, they're going to start right then and there, like interviewing me for a job or something. Like, this is not going to happen. Like, my social knowledge, tells me that. So, okay, so perception has a social dimension, which you can see at work in these examples. And the thing is that hijack perception, like, also has a social dimension. So I've been focusing on cases that are, maybe, okay, the guy in the fruit juice stand, he was wrong, but I don't know, maybe it was plausible. I guess if I'd had it when I was 20, it could have happened. But the feeling, these are all kind of innocuous things. Like, all these things are just innocuous. But the feeling, I know you know the feeling, of being just kind of summed up at a glance, for better or worse, by somebody. And if you are seen and summed up at a glance, say, as dangerous, then from the perceiver's point of view, the possibility of some kind of civil, like utterly unremarkable and even friendly interaction, that's backgrounded, and the possibility of, that you might do something really awful or disruptive, threatening, that's kind of looming. So these social versions of the problem of hijacked experience, they became more and more vivid to me, and they're very vivid and perhaps most extreme when perception leads quickly. This is really, really very extreme, but it leads very quickly to violence or even death. And when I began to think about cases that those happened, it really shifted the type of inquiry I was doing, because at first I was doing the kind of inquiry into a problem with an abstract structure, as I was describing at the start. But I began to think about kind of historically very specific situations of a kind that you really have to think about very specific cultural phenomena. So that's a very different kind of thing to do than the thing you do in the kind of philosophy where you're starting with a problem. Other kinds of philosophies start with like a historically specific phenomenon and ask various questions about that. So I'll give you some examples of the sorts of things that I began to think about in this connection. So there was the shooting and the killing of this 12-year-old boy named Tamir Rice, you probably heard of. That was in Cleveland. So the officer who saw him, so somebody, if you may know the story, because the political movement Black Lives Matter made these cases famous, if there hadn't been that political movement, wouldn't be, relatively common knowledge who these people were or what had happened. So they're publicized as a result of, one kind of activism. So that's why you might know that, somebody called the police in Cleveland and said, there's somebody with a gun in this playground. And then when the officer came, he saw him and decided to shoot with just in moments, really just a few moments of perceiving this boy. And when you shoot somebody, if you're a police officer, you have to call and say, what's happened. And so he reported it as, about 20 years old. And, you've probably seen pictures of Tamir Rice, perhaps you did at the time this happened a couple of years ago. So it looks like there's a sort of case where, that sizing up at a glance is happening. And there's certainly prior expectations. I mean, after all, police were called because there's somebody with a gun. It was a toy gun, by the way. It was a toy gun. So this boy is dead because of how he was perceived. And there are many cases like that. So there was the killing of an 18-year-old young man Michael Brown by Officer Darren Wilson's much publicity about this. This is the one in Ferguson. So Darren Wilson was testifying to a grand jury about how Michael Brown's face looked when they were physically struggling, and he was saying that Wilson had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. That's how angry he looked. Now, I don't know, and I don't claim to know what kinds of perceptual experiences these officers have in general, or these particular ones had, and just like we don't know whether to interpret the results of those experiments I described at the start as concerning experience or judgment. So the cases aren't necessarily giving us more instances of the problem. The problem, as I said, is specific to perceptual experience. But again, to think through the possible solutions to the problem, we don't need actual cases. We can use hypothetical versions of actual cases, but we're just assuming for the sake of argument that some kind of racialized expectations were giving rise to perceptual experiences in which these young people are appearing threatening or dangerous. So they're presenting the social affordances of doing something really terrible. In this case, the officers in these cases are responding to that experience. And then we can ask something that really it's a problem. When I say it's a problem, I mean, I don't think there's an obvious answer to this question. That's why it's a problem. But we can ask, just like we asked about Jill, okay, supposing they did have this perceptual experience if somebody is dangerous. And the reason I told you about these social affordances was to give you the sense that it's not unusual to have experiences of social affordances. It happens all the time. It happened to me in Mexico. It's happened to you, at parties or all the time. You do it. You're on the receiving end of it. It's just normal. But if these perceptual experiences were manifestations of a racialized attitude that black boys and black men are dangerous, well then, if it's a manifestation of that attitude, is it reasonable for people having those perceptual experiences to believe they're honest? It's just like the question we asked about Jill. Okay, now it's going to seem reasonable to them. This we know. To them, it's going to seem extremely reasonable because that's how it looks to them. That's how it looks to them. It's just going to be like you're looking for the mustard. You open the fridge and is there mustard? And there's a mustard. Good. Now, it's not really going to scratch your head about should you believe there's mustard. Like you just saw the mustard. It's going to seem to them as simple as that. Okay. So that's from their point of view, of course, they would say yes. But from Jill's point of view, she'd say yes. From the pre-formationist point of view, he'd say yes. Okay, that's what they'd say. But that doesn't mean automatically that we say yes. The problem is when we look at it from our perspective, kind of just standing outside of it, you can see reasons for saying yes. You can see reasons for saying no. Now, you probably know that police officers, and other people too, are legally allowed to use force based on perceptions of threat, so long as your perception is defined as reasonable. Okay, and then it turns out to be that it's the prosecutors and judges and juries and grand juries, or grand juries, that are allowed to determine what's reasonable. So now, it's very hard to see how you could have a police force at all without leeway for using force. I mean, that's what the police does. That's why you want to have a police force in society. At least I do. Some anarchists think you shouldn't. But I don't think that. I think it was probably good to have some police. Now, it's also very hard to see how you could have a decent policy about the leeway for using force without something like a reasonable person standard. It's not enough just to feel threatened on any old grounds. It's got to be reasonable fear. So it's very hard to see how you could do without this kind of standard. The difficulty comes in applying the standard. It's extremely difficult to apply the standard. There's all sorts of inconsistencies in how it is applied. And a wonderful book about these inconsistencies is called, it's by Caroline Light, and it's about the history of self-defense law in the US and the UK and the ways in which it's been applied very differently according to lines of gender and according to lines of race and both together. It's called Stand Your Ground. Okay, so the officer who shot and killed Tamir Rice, it was the 12-year-old boy, and the officer's name was Timothy Lohman, and the one who shot and killed Michael Brown, his name was Darren Wilson, they were not convicted. You may know their actions and therefore their beliefs about their threat were not found by the legal system to be unreasonable. They were found by the legal system to be reasonable. So that was the verdict that those entities reached, that part of the criminal justice system reached the verdict that actually it was reasonable. Now, when the juries or judges or prosecutors determine whether a defendant's perception of threat is reasonable, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to consider what a reasonable person in those circumstances, the circumstances of the defendant, would believe about whether they face an imminent and severe threat. Okay, is it reasonable? What do they, what would it be reasonable for somebody in that situation to believe about whether they face an imminent, severe threat, and if so, how imminent and how severe? So they're supposed to ask what would be reasonable to believe about those things in those circumstances. And on the prevailing view in philosophy and in law both, what it's reasonable for people to believe depends in part on how it's reasonable to respond to how things look to them. So in this case, the way other people look to them. That's what you're supposed to assess. So, but how you come to have the perceptual experience in which people look that way, that is just not supposed to matter. So if someone looks dangerous to you, it's be reasonable for you to believe that they're dangerous. And if you look dangerous to somebody else, you should excuse them if they become really agitated upon seeing you, because it's reasonable to be agitated in response to danger. So on the normal way of thinking about things, the entrenched way of thinking about things, that's how it is when you apply the reasonableness standard. You take as just a given, whatever the perceptual experiences were. You don't ask like how you got them. Okay. Now, on the rationality of perception view, the reasonableness of a belief doesn't just depend on how you respond to the perceptions you have. So it can also depend on which perceptual experiences you have in the first place. So for instance, a danger experience could be inferred from an unreasonable expectation. If, for example, it was inferred from an unreasonable expectation that was due, say, to a kind of prejudice, not a kind of gathering statistics, but a kind of prejudice, then that would be an experience that's not reasonable to have. So this way, the rationality of perception thesis is opening up another way of interpreting or figuring out how to apply reasonable person standards, because it's saying, well, when we assess what a reasonable person under similar circumstances would believe, we need not hold constant their perceptions. We need not hold that constant. A reasonable person in similar circumstances might not have the experience that they inferred from an unreasonable, prior belief, for example, prejudice. So I think this solution to the problem, the hijacked experience problem, I think it speaks to the social dimension of the problem. And of course, as you know, probably, when those officers failed to be convicted, and indeed after these young people were killed, thousands of people on the street, both before and after, but especially after the failure to convict. Why? Because they didn't think it was reasonable. They didn't think it was like a reasonable, this reasonable person in the situation, would they believe that this boy on a playground, was dangerous? It didn't seem like reasonable perception, to them. So it's not some sort of, it didn't seem like a reasonable belief in response to what was seen. If it was even on the table to talk about perceptions being reasonable and unreasonable, I think it'd be fair to say that the same people who thought it wasn't reasonable to believe that would also especially think it wasn't reasonable to perceive them that way. Okay, so one thing that interests me about the rationality of perception thesis is that it does have this consequence for how you might interpret, how to actually work with the reasonable person standards. And it's not just in police cases, any kind of self-defense, any kind of case where people are exerting a kind of aggression or violence that's normally not allowed, but is licensed if you're under attack. If somebody's attacking you, I can't just go up and, not that I can't go up and punch some random person in the face, but if that person is beginning to attack me, then, if I, push back or punch in the face, then that's all right, you know what I mean? So certain acts of physical violence that are licensed in these situations, and then the legal and moral question is, when is it okay to do things that normally aren't okay? So this is an instance of that. Okay. When I was talking about progress in philosophy as understanding different answers to questions and advantages and pitfalls, this is why I'm telling you about the application of the rationality of perception thesis to reasonable person standards in the law, just so you can see, well, where do you get to if you go down this path? That's one place that you get to. Okay, well, there's a lot else to say about why, whether one should go down the path or what all it takes to defend it. So I haven't said all that much about it, but I hope I've given you a feel for the problem space and what kinds of questions remain open.